in Texas, and he has over 20 years of journalistic experience in every form of media possible. He's got a hand in every important political discussion in the state of Texas, and so we're here today to glean a little bit of his inside baseball, if you will, on what's happening in Austin, across the state, and of course here in East Dallas. Brought to you by the Legislative and Economic Growth Committee of the Greater East Dallas Chamber of Commerce. And happy to have you, Scott. We appreciate you joining us.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, and congratulations to the East Dallas Chamber of Commerce. 75 years?
Yes,
Am I
sir.
reading that right? Since 1945. Very cool. What do you say about the elections that we just had and what it means for the legislative session? Doing an analysis of this kind of an election, two things come to mind. One is it's kind of like being a traffic accident investigator. You show up after the crash and you go, wow, there's broken glass over there and there's skid marks over there. What does it all mean? What exactly happened here? And then the other thing is something that a very smart Republican consultant said to me a few cycles ago in 2016. He said, you know what, we could try to learn everything that we can about this election, but then immediately forget it because we'll never have another election like that again. All right. So it's worth sort of deconstructing what happened in this election because it will inform what happens going forward. I saw just a few minutes ago, the Texas Agriculture Commissioner, Sid Miller, sort of acknowledged that Joe Biden is the president-elect, which some of our Republican office holders in Texas have been hesitant to do. Miller put out a fundraising note to supporters saying that he was going to have to fight back against the socialist crazies who despise us here in Texas. And he said that he needs your contributions now because, of course, during the legislative session, a little bit before and a little bit after, there's a blackout period where the office holders can't receive contributions. And he said in his message, quote, as the election fraud cases are being fought, and when Joe Biden potentially takes office in January, Texas leaders like me are going to, be unable to accept your help to fight back in January. So he needs your contribution right now. Send him $3 to fight socialism. That's the message. This was one of those, I hate to say overhyped elections, but certainly there was a lot of hype, right? About the main thing being in Texas, that Democrats would be able to take the majority in the Texas House. And there was so much talk about that earlier in the year, and especially during the summer, when you saw the poll numbers for Republicans just collapse everywhere because of the COVID-19 response. I don't think in my time covering politics, and I know all of you have been paying very close attention for a long time, we've never seen anything like a governor who enjoys, poll numbers around 70% approval. Republicans and Democrats both like Greg Abbott. Before COVID, they did. And then in about 6 weeks, his numbers collapsed down to 35% for his COVID-19 response. Very weak showing from the governor. And just this past week, he said that, unlike earlier in the year, when he was willing to put more restrictions in place, even though we see, an uptick now in the cases of COVID. And I know in Dallas County, y'all are suffering with, a lot more, in the way of numbers there and hospitalizations. But the governor insists we're not going to see any more, quote, lockdowns or any other restrictions. And the election, the way it played out, it's really the case that the Democrats did have the wind at their back, and they did have polling numbers on their side. And I know a lot of people were talking about the idea that the polls are all trash now. We ought to throw them away and never hire any of these people again. The thing about polls is, it's not a prediction of the future. So if you looked at the polls that were coming out and we were all hearing about in the middle of the summer that looked so good for legislative Democrats, and, there were some projections that they could win as many as 15 seats, 20 seats. Instead, tens of millions of dollars were spent on these races, and it was basically a wash. Right, one Republican in Houston got beaten, and one Democrat in Harris County down there got beat as well. Sarah Davis, the Republican, Gina Kalani, the Democrat, who was defeated. Otherwise, the partisan makeup of our congressional delegation is the same. The partisan makeup of the legislature is the same. We have an incoming speaker, a presumptive speaker, who I'll talk about here in a little bit. But to back up and talk about why the Democrats' aspirations didn't work out, basically two things. One is man-made. The elimination of straight ticket voting. We don't have that anymore. It was decided by the legislature in their infinite wisdom a couple of sessions ago. And I think in the final analysis, Republicans will probably only regret the fact that they didn't implement that sooner. In 2018, you had a confluence of events that was added up to a good year for Texas Democrats. You had 12 new Texas Democrats in the House, 2 in the Senate, in the Texas Senate, and 2 new congressional members who were Democrats from Dallas County and from Harris County. Colin Allred up there where you are, and Lizzie Fletcher down in Houston. Both of them, of course, won their re-elections this time around. But if 2018 was a new hope for Texas Democrats, I hate to use a movie analogy, but if it was a new hope for them in 2018, 2020 was the Empire Strikes Back. So in 2020, you had Republican candidates, consultants, the contributors really fight back to not let the same thing happen again. And, I had conversations, and I know y'all have probably talked with some of these folks as well. In 2018, it is the case that in some of those legislative races, you had Republicans get caught with their pants down. They weren't taking it seriously when 3 things were basically happening: backlash to President Trump, backlash to Senator Ted Cruz, and of course you had the Beto mania effect, which, the first 2 of those things, you could see those coming, but no one had even heard of Beto O'Rourke outside of El Paso County really before he ran for U.S. Senate. And because of that, and because you still had straight ticket voting in place, there were some Republicans who were just swept out with what unfolded. With straight ticket voting going away, that created an opportunity for Republicans this cycle to do what they really needed to do, especially in the middle of the summer and moving into the fall, which was differentiate themselves from President Trump. So that's the first thing that was fundamentally different, was the fact that that people didn't have the option to just pick their partisan jersey. But the other thing, and this was a choice, and look, everybody's handling this different. COVID-19, everybody's handling it different. In the last few months, I have spoken to 1 business group in person. Everyone else has been online the way we're doing it today. The only group that I spoke to in person was the Texas Restaurant Association. They had a meeting in San Antonio. And of course, the restaurants have a vested interest in proving that it's okay to have they absolutely have that incentive to show people they can have a meeting in person. We may have some restaurateurs on today, and I know that folks have been suffering, not just restaurants but all businesses, of course, and everybody grappling with how to deal with this. Others are doing it online the way we're doing it today. The legislature may do a certain amount of their legislating online. We'll see. There's been talk of public participation via Zoom, and I'll get to more of that just in a little bit. But the way it impacted the campaigns, the Democrats chose to basically stay locked in their houses, and the Republicans chose to do field operations the way they have always done them in the past, except they added masks and they would stand back from the front porch by about 10 feet. I went along with some Republican block walkers in Tarrant County in mid-September. And I know right now, some of y'all have heard this about how the Democrats were not block walking and the Republicans were. At quorumreport.com, we first picked up on this trend, this difference between the Republicans and Democrats in their campaigns in mid-September. We were first writing about it and asking the question, who had more downside risk? As business folks, you get this. Was it the Democrats who had more downside risk by failing to do person-to-person, one-on-one conversations with voters? Or was it Republicans with more downside risk being the ones to potentially offend people by showing up at their homes during a pandemic? I mean, those are both valid questions, right? What we know through some of that polling is that the people who were the super isolators, folks who are not even going to the grocery store, everything's being delivered to their home, they haven't been to a restaurant or anything else since March, those people are base Democrats, okay, for the most part. On the other end, and I've got friends on both sides of this, on the other end, you've got Republicans. Base Republicans are the ones who say no masks, no restrictions. They're the ones who would be, protesting alongside the new Republican Party chairman, Alan West, at the governor's mansion, saying that he needs to open up Texas. Those are base Republicans. So if you're going to send people, and I think Democrats sort of oversimplified the question as far as whether they should do block walking or not. But we know it's a more dynamic situation than that, and that they can be more sophisticated than that. They have polling and they have voter history to show who are the base Democrats and who are the base Republicans, right? And so they can choose when they give their block walkers or their candidates the addresses for that day to go knock on doors and talk to people. they can pick people who are soft Republicans, soft Democrats, swing voters, independent voters, et cetera. You probably know they can be sophisticated enough that when the block walker approaches a front door, they know that in that house there's a Republican, maybe somebody who voted in 4 Republican primaries. There's a soft Republican, maybe one who voted in 1 Republican primary, and there's a Democrat in that house. That means there's a dad who's a really, strong Republican. There's a mom who sometimes does, and there's a 19-year-old daughter who probably supported Bernie Sanders. They know that when they walk up to the house. So they know who they're encountering, and they know who they would be able to talk to when they get there to try to convince people to vote for them. And without bad-mouthing President Trump, it's what Republicans desperately needed to do, is differentiate themselves from him, because it's true that Trump is toxic in the suburbs with so many folks who otherwise would vote for Republicans, and that's borne out in the numbers. Let me give you a couple in the election results. Let me give you a couple of these, and I know that y'all are familiar with some of them, especially in Dallas, but it's not possible to have the kind of numbers I'm about to read without the difference being that Republicans were talking to folks one-on-one and Democrats just were not doing that. Democrats were doing things like Facebook Live events and phone banking and digital media and that sort of thing. But it's very, very easy to just hang up the phone if it's a phone banker, to turn off the Facebook Live. If I'm boring you right now, you can just turn off the Zoom meeting. Right. But if I'm standing on your porch, you got to talk to me for a little bit to get me out of there. So that's the difference. In Harris County, Mike Schofield, the Republican, he won his race 51.9%, while Trump was losing the district 48.5%. In Fort Bend County, J.C. Jatan, who's taking the Rick Miller seat down there, he won 51.9%. Trump was losing the district 47.9%. Up in Dallas County, where y'all are, Morgan Meyer, he won his race. He was coming in at 49.7%, in the returns as we saw them, and Trump was losing the district. He only got 42%. The president got 42% there. So you have Meyer greatly outperforming President Trump. Same thing with Angie Chen Button, where she got 48.9 and Trump was getting 44% in that district. And down in Harris County, Lacey Hull, who's a new member who's going to be taking the seat vacated by Dwayne Bohack from Houston, in that seat, Hull, the Republican, was winning the Texas House district 51.6, and Trump was losing the House district 47.2. You can only accomplish that kind of a result if you don't take any tools off the table. The Republicans were also doing, digital strategies, television ads, mail pieces, and all of that stuff, but they were going that extra mile of choosing, and it was a choice of choosing to embrace traditional field operations at a time when some folks might have thought voters would be potentially offended by that. And I can tell you by just what I witnessed when I was in Tarrant County, in Mansfield, as an example, some of the people who were said to be swing voters, they were not only not offended that people were showing up, they were thrilled to have anybody come to the house and talk to them, because a lot of folks have been isolated, and are happy to see anybody. And what they were doing, not all that sophisticated. And the science told us by July and August that what I'm about to describe is okay. They would ring the doorbell after putting a piece of literature on the door, step back 10 feet with a mask on, and if the person came out, they would talk to them. They would engage with them about their issues. And that allowed Republicans to talk about things like healthcare, about defending the police rather than defunding the police. I'll talk more about that in a second. And big investments in public schools, infrastructure, et cetera. Now, the issues that worked in the campaign, if 2018 was a referendum on healthcare and on pre-existing conditions specifically, because we know, especially in those congressional races, that was what turned the tide for the Democrats. This idea that Republicans, even 2, 4, and 6 years ago, when arguing about the Affordable Care Act, Republicans would never have said that it's the government's role to try to protect your pre-existing condition, or protect you, if you have one. And Democrats were making that argument in 2018 very successfully. Well, Republicans figured that out. I was at the State Republican Executive Committee meeting in January, pre-COVID. And Robin Armstrong, who's the doctor who is, he was kind of made famous this year because he was down in, I think, in Lake Jackson, giving hydroxychloroquine to some of the patients at a nursing home when President Trump was really promoting that. Robin Armstrong is the national committee man for the Republican Party of Texas. And he was telling candidates and other Republicans at this meeting back in January, you've got to have a message on healthcare. And he admitted, he said, I don't even know what the message needs to be, but you need to figure it out, because that's what Democrats are going to run on, because it was very successful for them in 2018. Well, you saw where Republicans previously would have said it's not the government's role to do that, to have any say in what happens with pre-existing conditions. This year, you saw television advertisements and debates play out of Republicans and Democrats arguing over who could protect pre-existing conditions better, right? And so that had the net effect, I think, of neutralizing the issue, where a lot of voters thought, well, they all want to protect pre-existing conditions. It's now baked in, where the ACA, of course, is still controversial, and there are a lot of parts of it that people don't like. But for protecting pre-existing conditions, it is as accepted that the government's going to do that as it's accepted that the government's going to ensure that people have Medicaid and Social Security, right? Medicare and Social Security. So that issue was neutralized. On defunding the police, I get this question a lot. Did that really matter? Did that really hurt the Democrats? The answer is it was toxic for Democrats. And when Republicans in Texas run out of winning arguments, which happens, they can always count on Austin City Hall to bail them out with something to be against. Right. In Austin, they had voted to cut some funding and divert some funding in the Austin Police Department. It wasn't as extreme as Republicans tried to make it sound at all. I live in Austin, and I'm just fine. It's not a war zone or anything down here. I have heard less about it seeming like a war zone in Austin after the election. So I would just note that. But the fact is that Democrats really had no answer for this. I think Democrats didn't take it seriously. I think the Democrats sort of, as the kids say, they were clowning on Greg Abbott when he would go and do his press conferences talking about defending the police. And you all remember in the last couple of months, he unveiled his Back the Blue pledge, and he invited lawmakers and candidates from both parties to sign a pledge saying that they don't support defunding the police. When he first proposed the Back the Blue pledge and people signing it, the chairman of the Democratic caucus in the Texas House, Chris Turner, put out a statement along with Garnett Coleman, the county affairs chairman from Houston, who's another veteran lawmaker, and they both said, look, we're not for defunding the police, and we don't know anybody running for the legislature who's for defunding the police. So they made their position clear. But I was talking with some folks the other day who said, why didn't the Democrats, why doesn't Chris Turner or whoever pick up the phone and call some of their Democratic members, legislators, and candidates and say, why don't a dozen of us just go to one of Greg Abbott's events and sign the Back the Blue pledge and take it off the table? Because we don't agree with defunding police. Don't let them beat you up with that. Whether it was an unfair attack or not, and I would say, just in my estimation, it was not a fair attack, because none of these folks are in favor of defunding or getting rid of police. But it's on the people who are running as Democrats, it's on their consultants, it's on the candidates, et cetera, to come up with an answer for the attack, to either neutralize it the way the Republicans did with healthcare, or come up with something that it puts the Republicans back on their heels, which the Democrats just never did that. So ceding field operations to Republicans and having no answer on the defunding police attack were just critical in the way these elections unfolded. And the point I would make about the polls, which I mentioned earlier, which showed the Democrats really did have the wind at their back. It's not that the polls were wrong. It's just that only the Republicans were willing to do something about it, that they were willing to do the things it took to change the numbers, to really make the case to people that you can't go with Democrats, even if you're somebody who is not supporting President Trump. There were a lot of folks who were open to the argument that, hey, maybe I would support Joe Biden, and there'll be a lot of slicing and dicing of the numbers as we go forward, after this election. But even if you're somebody who would say, I'm either going to not vote in the presidential race, or I'm going to vote for Biden because I just disapprove of President Trump, but I still consider myself a pretty conservative person or a Republican person, then I can still support Republicans down the ballot. And you saw people doing that. And anybody who slept on that in 2018, really made a big mistake, because there was already a universe in 18 of 500,000 people in a midterm election. There were 500,000 who voted for Beto O'Rourke and then voted for Greg Abbott and voted for other Republicans down the ballot. So what was that number in this year in Texas. As I say, we'll still be going through the numbers, sifting through the data, but there certainly is a significant number of swing voters or people who are more traditional Republican voters in Texas. To give you a sense of that number, President Trump's support eroded again in 2020. He, only outperformed Hillary Clinton by 9 points. I say only because it's been double digits throughout modern history for Republican candidates in Texas. But if you look at the result this year, President Trump only won by 6. Well, that doesn't mean that Republican support in Texas has eroded that much. It means that President Trump's support has eroded that much. Senator Cornyn beat his opponent by 10 points, which I would say he set the Republican baseline moving forward for the next decade as Republicans get ready to do redistricting. And they will use the numbers from this election that we just had, where we did have a lot of these swing voters in different communities that voted in different ways. They'll be using those numbers when they put the maps together when they do redistricting in the next legislative session. To think through what's going to happen in this session, we look at the fact that we're on Zoom today and that they have not yet figured out how to even hold meetings at the Texas Capitol. One meeting, they've been trying to figure out how to do this, and they have had some discussions, and there have been some meetings. But you may have seen updates if you're a subscriber at Quorum Report. We've been updating the fact that meetings have been scheduled and then canceled. The Sunset Commission meeting, which of course the Sunset Commission made up of lawmakers and others, they had scheduled a meeting and they had to cancel it, quote, due to COVID. It was our understanding that some lawmakers had been exposed. We didn't hear about a positive test of anybody, but had been at least exposed to COVID. I was in the Texas Capitol a couple of weeks ago, the day after the election, when presumptive Speaker Dade Phelan made his announcement that he had enough votes, he had secured enough pledges to be the next Speaker of the House. It was the first time I had been in the Capitol since the pandemic began, and it is a little surreal. There's nobody in there except, well, there were a few reporters, a few journalists like me, and everybody else is wearing a state trooper's uniform. They weren't doing the normal security that you're all familiar with when you go to the Capitol and have to go through the metal detector and all that. They didn't need to do that because an armed trooper walked me from the north door of the Capitol to the press conference room and then back out to the door. It's, the guy is very nice and everything, but it seems a little over the top for them to have to do that. But that's the way they're handling security at the Capitol right now. And that's with nobody in it. I mean, over the last couple of months, we have reported on the fact that the Capitol would have to be shut down and completely sanitized because they had one case of one trooper testing positive for COVID-19. And again, that's essentially with nobody in the building. And so then it would be shut down for 3 days, not even open to troopers for a little while they would sanitize the building. So how would that actually work during a pandemic? Of course, we've seen the news about a vaccine. Governor Abbott is in Lubbock this afternoon to talk about therapeutics for COVID-19. He's talked a lot in interviews lately. Governor Abbott has talked about the idea that, President Trump was able to get some of these therapeutics, and then you saw him right back out on the campaign trail and, in inclement weather. And, he's an elderly person and he was just fine. So these are the kind of things that we're going to have in Texas very soon. Abbott's talking about distributing those things very soon. We've heard from Pfizer now that they have a vaccine that's 95% effective, and they're waiting for all the, all of the green lights from the federal government. But it's not vaccines that make people better. It's vaccinations, right? You've got to get the vaccine into people's arms, right, before it makes any difference. And it's just about impossible that that's going to be the case, that's going to happen before we get through the 5-month legislative session. Anything's possible, I guess, but that does not seem likely. So what is a legislative session going to be like during a pandemic? There have been a lot of ideas thrown around. I'll give you some of them. The Texas Senate apparently is going to be very cautious, very, very cautious. The lieutenant governor on September 1st at 10 p.m., this was our reporting, he convened a conference call of the chairman and chairwomen in the Texas Senate and talked about worst case scenarios as far as public access, limiting the ability of people to visit the Capitol while they're in session. And what came out of that was that Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, not interested in having people be in the Senate chamber. He'd like to have legislative hearings where maybe no public, no members of the public are in attendance. Certainly no food and drink from lobbyists brought into the Capitol. He'd like to see limited staffers, maybe 1 or 2 staffers per Senate office, and everybody in the office, in those offices, would have to be tested for COVID-19 once a week. The lieutenant governor has had health problems in the last 2 years, and we're told that he's very nervous about getting sick. Of course, this is the same person, I'm paraphrasing, but the lieutenant governor is the same person who told Tucker Carlson on Fox News earlier this year that elderly people should basically jump on the grenade for the sake of the economy. And so now some folks find it sort of hypocritical that he's now talking about essentially having state government shut down, to the people anyway. And over in the House, because we haven't had a hierarchy in the House after the last speaker said that he was retiring, and now we finally do have a presumptive speaker after the election who put together a work group, which we haven't heard too much out of that just yet, but he put together, Dade Phelan put together a bipartisan work group for folks to start talking about how they're going to handle operations during the legislative session. But the administration chairman, Charlie Guerin, did put out a survey earlier in the year asking legislators what they thought about how the legislative session should go. And a lot of it was, it's a lot of stuff that you would expect. Lawmakers, the 150 members of the House, I think it was 80% of them said that there should be masks and temperature checks at the doors, and there should be, limited access to the Capitol. The members were also allowed to offer just general comments, as freewheeling as they wanted to be. And one of them had, I thought, a pretty funny comment. They said maybe that the lawmakers ought to be in a bubble like the NBA. One person said, well, if those people are in a bubble, they'll kill each other, so they can't do that. But then at the same time, you had a senior Republican senator say to me, that unlike Major League Baseball, unlike the NBA, if they do have to quarantine for 14 days during a legislative session, which they only get 5 months in a regular session, the senator said there's no other team to take the field if they have to quarantine. So they've got to be extra careful. So there is going to be a balance between keeping the lawmakers healthy versus giving public access. Now, the Texas Constitution says that the House and Senate will have, quote, open sessions. That word open is going to be, open to interpretation, because I think there is going to be some limitation of people being in the Capitol. It could create constitutional challenges to anything that they would pass on any topic, any sort of legislation about anything. You've seen the evidence in the lawmakers' sensitivity to offering public access and public input on things when very controversial bills will be proposed, things like abortion bills, the bathroom bill from 2 sessions ago, et cetera. You'll see just hours and hours of testimony. I mean, they'll take testimony, right, Jonathan, until 5 in the morning on some of these things. We've seen these hearings go on. The reason they're doing that is that if they pass an abortion bill, it's not that they think they might go to court. They're going to court if they pass an abortion bill, right? It's going to end up in the federal courts regardless. So one of the first things that they need to be able to say in front of a judge is, we gave plenty of chance for people from all over Texas to weigh in on this piece of legislation. So if they pass anything controversial whatsoever during a legislative session where they don't allow people to have the same kind of access, that could create a serious problem for any of those, potential new statutes that they might put into place.
Yeah. That can't be overstated, right? I mean, the potential for any piece of legislation to be challenged in court due to its constitution and have an open session is just
unprecedented.
Right.
The founders of the state and the founders of the state government, they thought of this. I mean, in the Texas Constitution, it does say also that a legislative session can be held somewhere other than the Capitol building in times of disease. And so what does that mean? One of the ideas that's been floated is, potentially they could hold a legislative session at the Austin Convention Center, where they could space out just the way the Texas Restaurant Association had spaced out their meeting the other day. They had 200 restaurateurs in a ballroom that probably, without social distancing, one of those ballrooms that could probably hold 1,000 or 1,500 people, and they just had 200 people spaced out. Spaced out in the same way that they'd have to be in a restaurant. So if anybody says that they know exactly how this is going to work, they're getting out over their skis, as they say. We don't know yet. We've got our ear to the ground all the time at quorumreport.com. I think during one of these sort of super secret sessions, which is what it could be. I mean, transparency is going to potentially be sorely lacking. You could see a grotesque abuse, lack of transparency. But we all know that they play hide the ball enough at the Texas Capitol when all of these restrictions aren't in place. That certain things will happen, and even folks close to the process will wonder, how did they? Can they do that? Is that the way that and veteran observers of the process will look at it and oftentimes wonder if the legislature was allowed to do something the way that they just did it. I think that's why it's going to be key for business folks, for anybody who has any interest in what's happening at the Capitol. It's key to have people who have longstanding relationships with lawmakers and staffers. People who will, when you text them, they will text you back because there may not be the same kind of access to people. During a legislative session, a lot of times you'll hear from different lobby teams that they either realized that they were in trouble on their bill because they didn't get texts back from people that they were, trying to communicate with about something, or they saw somebody walk into an office and they said, why did that person walk into that office? And suddenly they have that, what conversation is going on there? If people aren't actually in the building, they can't watch all these things unfold. So having, veteran lobby teams of people who know what they're doing, have been around in the political process for a long time, is going to be key in trying to influence the legislative process and trying to have any sort of a say for business interests and just for average Texans, trying to have any say in what unfolds at the legislative session. Now, I have heard, and we've heard and reported this out at Quorum Report, that the governor's office has floated the idea, at least privately, of having legislators do maybe a truncated 45-day legislative session just about the Texas budget, to tackle that, adjourn sine die, and then potentially come back later in the year as we make progress with vaccines, as we make progress with being able to hold a session safely for everybody, some smaller targeted special sessions on various topics, including redistricting, which is going to be another one of those throwdowns next year. Of course, redistricting is the most bitter partisan thing that they do. When they're passing bills, Jonathan, there are two kinds of bills that the lawmakers read every word of. Those are ethics bills and redistricting bills, because those are the bills about them. Right. So there are also some theories out there that maybe what they would do is come in the first day that they're scheduled to be there in January, just elect the speaker, adopt rules in the House and the Senate, and gavel out for a month or 6 weeks, and then reassess and see where they're at. That way, if they recess and come back, in a month or whatever, they can, gauge without having to have a special session, they could gauge where they're at and figure out whether or not it's safe to have a legislative session and tackle some of these big things. And the issues that are on the table are huge. For business folks and others, it's going to be hard to get the attention of these people when they're facing a $4.6 billion budget deficit, which could get worse based on the economic conditions and what the comptroller has to say in his next revenue estimate in January. Then you have the fact that public schools and public ed has been made big promises under what was passed in the last legislative session under House Bill 3, the big school finance reform bill, buying down property taxes and all of that. They'll be wrestling with all of that in 2019. Easy to forget that now that we're in a global or coming out of a global recession. In 2019, they went in with a surplus. They had plenty of money in the bank, and they chose to. This is the folks who tell you they're fiscally conservative all the time and beat you over the head with that all the time. These are the people who chose to spend all the money in the bank to pay for public education and to pay for buying down property taxes, which I know nobody has any more complaints about their property taxes in Texas. So I'm being facetious, of course. So tackling those sorts of issues, dealing with all of that in the midst of, potentially still a raging pandemic. Here we are in another wave of it, with danger danger everywhere, especially in our urban centers and out in El Paso and down in the valley as well. Lubbock, another hot spot as of late. That's why Governor Abbott is speaking there today.
Yeah, and the
And then there
CDC
is
just recommended that nobody travel for Thanksgiving, which is un-American.
right. I mean, people are not obviously very unhappy with all of this, and
Right.
I'm also interested to see what the governor's real political fortunes are and how much influence he's able to exert over the legislature when in his first sessions as governor, and it has gone through 3 sessions now as governor. He started to make up some ground with this, but in the first 2 sessions, he didn't have a good working relationship with the legislative body at all. I think he's tried to reassert at least his relationship with the Republican members by backstopping them in their campaigns, making sure that they had the kind of resources they needed to beat the Democrats and hold their majority in the Texas House. But his popularity is still through the floor as far as I can tell. His people will tell you, his campaign will tell you that their internal polling for Abbott, that the numbers have come up. But when I just anecdotally, when I talk to, and this is people who are Republicans, when I talk to conservative radio hosts, Mark Davis there in Dallas or Chad Hasty out in Lubbock, the audience feedback that they get from conservatives is they don't want Abbott there. And if they had somebody else to vote for in a primary today, they would do it. That doesn't mean he would lose a primary, in a couple of years, but that's the attitude of folks right now. And I would keep a very close eye on this special election up there in North Texas for the Senate district seat, Senate District 30, between Shelley Luther, y'all's rebel salon owner there in Dallas, and Drew Springer, the agriculture chairman in the Texas House. Luther's entire campaign is basically anti-Abbott.
Right.
It's anti the governor and anti his executive orders. And so, depending on how this legislative session, depending on how that race unfolds, that'll tell us something about what the attitude among Republican voters is about the governor, because that's really a test for whether that message resonates with people. And then what happens in the legislative session, the other big issue that I didn't really mention is that I hear from Republicans and Democrats alike. They would like to see some sort of reform to the way that the disaster powers work in the executive branch, that they don't necessarily agree that the governor should just have a blank check to be able to unilaterally make these huge decisions that impact people's lives directly in that race. And this tells you how seriously Chairman Springer is taking it. In that race, Drew Springer, he filed on the first day of pre-filing bills, he filed a measure that would disperse the power from the executive branch and would create a new board that includes the governor to make so it wouldn't take the governor out of it completely, but it would allow for other statewide office holders to have a say in how those disaster powers are exercised. And I believe, I don't have all the details of it in front of me, but either after 20 or 30 days after an executive action during a disaster, the legislature could potentially be immediately and automatically called into a special session to review what the governor's doing and then either give it the thumbs up or thumbs down. So all those things are on the table moving into January.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack there, and some really, really heavy stuff for a legislator to figure out.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I don't envy all these people. I remember just real quick. I think it was in the 2013 session. It was the former chairman of the Public Education Committee, Jimmy Don Aycock from Killeen. We were on the floor of the House, budget night, which of course the budget always takes them, into the early morning hours to go through all the amendments and hear all the arguments about all that stuff. And he was just standing in the back of the House chamber, and he was kind of chuckling to himself. I said, "What's up, Chairman?" And he said, and it's just kind of laughing about how ridiculous it all is. He said, "I spent $300,000 to be here." And he said, "Wasn't my money, but I spent it." So, yeah, they put all this money and effort into a job that I think a lot of people might not envy having right now.
Every time I have a discussion with a lawmaker, I mean it when I say it. I'm glad it's them and not me.
Right.
Because it's a grueling industry. Speaking of lawmakers, we have a new one here in East Dallas in House District 100. Lorraine Bearable lost her reelection bid to Jasmine Crockett.
Yep.
coming in as a freshman. And we were wondering what are you hearing that we can expect from Jasmine Crockett as a state rep?
You know, I'm not all that familiar with her, although I did meet with her after the election, and she's a very energetic person, somebody who is interested to really get down to Austin and represent the community and represent it well. And my impression was just that she's somebody who, for maybe unfairly having a reputation as a real, far left rebel rouser or something. I didn't get that impression at all. I think that she's very serious about wanting to represent her community. I know that it's top of mind for her that there aren't enough grocery stores, in the area. I don't think there's one Kroger in the whole district. I might be wrong about that, but she's somebody who wants to work on economic development for the community, somebody who wants to really get in there and make a difference. And I don't know that she would say this, but I think some others might observe that, in the area that she's representing, maybe it wasn't getting that kind of attention from the previous office holder. And I don't mean Lorraine Birabel. So it's I think a really interesting time for her to come in as a freshman Democratic lawmaker who I think maybe is more progressive, but also just my impression is somebody who actually wants to get things done, and I think would probably work with the Republican majority if she thought she was doing the right things to represent her district.
Right, and I know we're all looking forward to working with her in the East Dallas business community.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to also speak specifically to redistricting. What are your thoughts on the timeline that, and what kind of impact can we see from the census?
We see President Trump trying to rush things in Washington on that, but there's talk that the census data won't be potentially transmitted to the states until after our legislative session is normally over. So I could see and I had heard, one source told me that the lieutenant governor, based on what was going on with Trump, the lieutenant governor expected to see the census data come to Texas, be transmitted from the feds before the end of a legislative session, a regular session. So potentially redistricting could be in the mix for this session, but that's not a done deal at all. I don't even know how many billions of dollars it takes for them to do the census. More than 5 billion or whatever it is. It's a lot of money.
That'd be an astronomical number.
Well, you could imagine all that money potentially just the sound of it flying out the window if Biden and his administration incoming decides that they need to basically redo the whole thing or close to it, because there's been all this talk of a rushed census not getting an accurate count. And so I don't know how they're going to prioritize that out of Washington. I mean, the bottom line is there are so many questions about it, fundamental questions that have yet to be answered about the timeline. But for the talk of the incoming speaker, Dade Phelan, and you probably want to talk about him too, but he wants to work with Democrats. He made it clear in his first appearance as presumptive speaker at that news conference I attended at the Capitol. He made the point that being the speaker isn't about being, the most conservative or the most liberal or anything about ideology or anything about, being a Republican or a Democrat. It's just about being somebody who Republicans and Democrats alike trust to oversee the legislative process and to be an honest broker. If the speaker doesn't agree with you about your piece of legislation, the old school way of doing it, which I think Phelan will probably adhere to based on his philosophy that he laid out, he would say, look, go find your votes. If you've got the votes to pass your deal, then, we're not going to deny you the chance to debate it. Obviously going to be easier to find votes for Republican priorities than Democratic ones, with the majority being held. But on redistricting, once they get to that, it is always the most partisan exercise. And on top of that, we have to lay the fact that, in the past, they had to consider whether the federal courts would step in and tell them that potentially this map is too partisan, whether they were looking at the Texas House, Texas Senate, or the congressional districts. But the federal courts in the last few years have ruled that, or the Supreme Court ruled that, and when the Supreme Court found this, it was even less conservative than it is constituted today after President Trump's nominations. the Supreme Court has said that the federal courts have no role in deciding whether a legislative map is too partisan. The only sort of court challenges that can be brought on a legislative or congressional map now has to do with racial discrimination. So we may see some court challenges along those lines. But right now, if they take the numbers from this last couple elections that we just had with record turnout in 2018 and 2020, they take those numbers and plug them into the computer and say, draw 90 Texas House districts that are Republican. They can do that. They can go with that. There's not much the Democratic minority can do about it. So it'll be really key that we do have some senior Democratic lawmakers who are, still in place, still will be seeking out roles with leadership and in leadership, and making, this is the way it works in redistricting, and making deals on keeping their districts intact when some of those districts may change dramatically. I mean, this is an extreme example, but it wouldn't be out of the question to think that, if they've got to change Tarrant County up a little bit because we see all these new Democrats in there, then, Fort Price could represent Amarillo and part of the Tarrant County suburbs. So you could have a district that stretches all the way. But if people think I'm being extreme, I live in a district in Austin, a congressional district, Michael McCall's district, that stretches all the way to Houston, right, for that exact reason.
Straight to Katy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's kind of a twist of the stake of the heart for the Democratic hopes that, with taking the majority in the House, they would have had skin in the game for redistricting.
Yeah, and it's one other thing that we should mention about that is that, this was the big, I mean, if Democrats were going to swing for the fences in legislative races, and they tried to do that this year, but were hobbled by the choices they made and how they responded to the pandemic, this was the year to do it. This is the end of the redistricting cycle. What happens with those districts is, when they first draw the maps, they draw three maps: the House, the Texas House, Texas Senate, and the congressional districts, as you know. And when they do that, each district is optimized for partisan advantage. Here are Republican districts, here are Democratic districts, and of course, and they do it once every 10 years. So when they first do it after the census, that district is as rock solid Republican as it's going to be. But then when you have exponential and explosive growth like we have had in Houston and in Dallas-Fort Worth in particular, those communities change. People are born, people die, people move, from all over the country, and all over the world, frankly. And when we still have 1,000 people moving to Texas every day, even during the pandemic, those neighborhoods continue to change right now. And so the partisan structure of each district, it degrades over the years because you don't know who all these people are moving in and out. And so those districts in this cycle on November 3rd, they were as degraded from a partisan standpoint as possible for the decade. It's the end of the cycle. And so this was the chance for Democrats, and it didn't happen. And so now what's going to happen in that redistricting process that you're asking about next year is Republicans are going to use those numbers, shore up those districts, once again, optimize them for partisan advantage. And that sets the table and allocates power for the next decade.
Right. Entire generation.
Yeah.
Speaking of presumptive speaker Dade Phelan, what are we hearing are the priorities for him as a speaker? And what kind of speaker do you think he will be? And I'll add one on there. Do you think there's any chance for him to reconcile with Allen West?
Let me take the last one first. No, I don't think so. And it's hard to reconcile with somebody who's not interested in meeting. I don't think that Allen West is interested in anything other than protesting state government right now. And just to say something about the Republican Party of Texas, two things. One, and these things play right off of each other. Because of the election we just had and what we were just talking about with the Democrats, failing to take advantage of those districts the way they were currently constituted, it remains true that the election of consequence in Texas is the Republican primary, right? And so over the last decade, you've had third-party groups like Empower Texans, Texas Right to Life, et cetera, who are funded by these West Texas billionaires. I call them right-wing enforcement groups. Those groups have played heavy in those GOP primaries. And now in the Republican Party of Texas, the actual party apparatus, you have a chairman who is more of that sort of mold, that ilk of being, sort of a conservative agitator who runs around calling people. He called Phelan, as you know, he called him a political traitor for seeking Democratic support in his bid for Speaker. He said that he was cozying up to the radical leftist socialists and all of this, which just kind of makes me laugh because Democrats in the Texas legislature are probably not as liberal as Democrats in the California legislature or New York, for example. So that's a silly attack, but I do think that it matters as far as the members of the legislature are concerned, because now you have the Republican Party basically queuing up to try to punish Republican members of the legislature if they don't adhere to the GOP platform and the GOP legislative priorities. Some of those priorities are getting rid of abortion completely, banning what they call quote unquote taxpayer lobbying, which for certain business groups and for other organizations is key to be able to have representatives at the Capitol on their issues. And so as far as Phelan's legislative priorities, I'm not 100% sure on that just yet. He hasn't really tipped his hat on that sort of thing. He's keeping his powder dry, if you will. But as far as what kind of speaker he may be, and a lot of people had never even heard of Dade Phelan. I know him pretty well from covering him in the legislature for the last few sessions. He was a staffer for both Democrat and Republicans previously, and ran for office. He's from Beaumont, Texas, from the Golden Triangle, and he has a history of operating in a pretty deft manner at the Capitol. I'll give you an example. So last session, it was a very important piece of legislation for employers in Dallas and Houston and elsewhere to cancel out some of these local ordinances that had to do with paid sick leave and scheduling and some other employment regulations. And Senator Brandon Creighton from Conroe, from the Woodlands area, he had carried the bill in the Senate. And y'all probably remember what happened under pressure from the lieutenant governor. Social conservative politics was injected into that. And it was possible under the language that the Senate adopted that chambers of commerce would have been pretty upset because they were leaving open the possibility of also canceling out equal rights ordinances and protections for LGBTQ people. And that was, here we go, right-wing social conservative politics making its way into a business issue that ought to be pretty straightforward and was pretty important to business leaders. That legislation was passed through the Senate, sent over to the House, where it went through the State Affairs Committee, where Dade Phelan was the chairman. And I was wondering how he's going to handle this. And he seemed to say, and outright through his actions, he seemed to say, and then later in on the record comments, outright said, we should not be bashing gay people in the year 2019. And I don't know that people expected the Republican from Beaumont, Texas to say that. But the bills ended up, on the ash heap because the House and Senate were not going to agree about that. And so, I think Phelan is a pretty conservative guy. He's a business guy. He's a commercial real estate guy from Southeast Texas. I would say he's probably on balance as conservative as Dennis Bonnen, but he is not Dennis Bonnen. They have very different personalities, and I think that Phelan understands, maybe in a way that Bonnen probably understood but didn't exercise. Phelan knows that the House members expect the Speaker to be independent from the governor and from the lieutenant governor. And I think there was some pretty quick buyer's remorse with House members in 2019 when, and this was way before the meeting that Bonnen had and flamed out with Empower Texans. But as the legislative session was getting going, I think members of the legislature expected that he would not be in lockstep with the governor on just about everything, but he was. And so I don't think Phelan is going to be protesting the governor or anything. I don't think he's going to be, publicly at odds with the governor. But a lot of times what the Speaker is there to do is just to kind of put the brakes on things, and the way that Joe Strauss did over the years. It wouldn't necessarily have been the case that Strauss would publicly speak out against something he was against. That thing just wouldn't pass the House, right? It just wouldn't go anywhere. It would die in a committee or whatever. And when Strauss came out when he came out so aggressively against the bathroom bill, there were a lot of folks who were speculating that meant that he really wanted to stay as Speaker and fight. And I read it exactly the opposite, that now that he was saying that he was tired of this from the Texas Senate, and that he was sort of openly just arguing with the lieutenant governor about what Strauss thought was just a silly piece of legislation that was distracting from real issues in Texas. I felt that meant he was probably done with the whole thing, because the way that he previously would have operated was the Senate would pass a silly piece of legislation or a harmful piece of legislation, and the House just wouldn't do that thing. And as Strauss always talked about, in the legislative process, when you're trying to make law in Texas, the House and Senate, there's two chambers for a reason. They both have to do the thing, or that thing doesn't happen, right? And it doesn't have to be a protest. I remember, I think it was during the 2015 legislative session, toward the end of the session, I was told the story by a member who was in the members lounge toward the end of the session. They said that they weren't doing much on the House floor that day, and that's why this person was in the lounge. And this member said to Strauss, he said, it doesn't seem like we're getting a lot done here at the end of session. And Strauss just kind of looked like this. So he was just done passing things at that point. So that was sort of that was the old way of handling it. I kind of imagine that Phelan, because of the way that he has laid out his philosophy on things, is not somebody who's going to, be a rebel rouser. He's going to try to create consensus. That's the way he ran for speaker. When I asked him in that press conference, I asked him, what is the argument that resonated with the members of the House to pick you as speaker? What was it that you said to them? What was the thing that brought them around to agreeing to support you? And Phelan said that it had to do with the argument of being somebody that they would trust to oversee the legislature, or oversee the lower chamber of the legislature, and oversee the legislative process, and not necessarily that they will always agree about all of the issues, because they're certainly not going to.
That's some good stuff. Scott Braddock of the Quorum Report, thank you so much on behalf of the Greater East Dallas Chamber of Commerce. We appreciate you spending part of your lunch hour with us. For anybody who's interested in the inside political scene, quorumreport.com, you can find this type of reporting and even more. So thank you very much, and we greatly appreciate it and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, my friend. Anytime. Thanks to all of you.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it.